Appreciate your company, and we're looking forward to some discussion at the end where we can share ideas. We're going to offer some of our thoughts at the start, but always great, especially in such an intimate gathering, to get some thoughts from the group that are here. I would also like to start by acknowledging and paying my sincere respects to the traditional custodians and elders of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, past, present and future, on whose lands I live, research, learn and teach, and from where we're speaking today. And we recognise that these lands have never been ceded, and we commit to learning, to working and living together better on country. So we live in wild cities, but what does it mean to be wild in the 21st century? And how is our concept of civilization grounded in damage and dispossession? If we accept, as we do, that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, what can we do to shift that? Do we care enough for the earth and for each other to reimagine the future? So in this climate of profound change, the conditions do exist in our cities for regeneration, but they need to be seeded and nurtured, and our wounded, darkest places gently, lovingly brought to the surface to be healed. Together with care, we can change our cities here and now. But how do we do this? So 4 new books explore these entangled questions and prospects. Wild Policy, Indigeneity and the Unruly Politics of Intervention by Tess. And thanks, Tess, for coming down from Sydney with Molly, who you can see sitting up the back there. Dirt Theory, Troubling Architecture by Hélène. People Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons by Ashley Dawson, who's in New York, sends his apologies, would love to be here, and hopefully the video will work, which highlights some of his thoughts and perspectives on this. And Planning Wild Cities, Human-Nature Relationships in the Urban Age, which is my recent book. So we have most of the authors here today. It's an interdisciplinary discussion, and again, we're really interested in your thoughts on this too. Just a quick introduction. Professor Tess Lee is an anthropologist who specialises, according to her website, on the issues of dysfunction. She can explain more about that later. How dysfunction occurs, to what, to whom, and to how it's ascribed. So her work seeks to introduce new ways of thinking about policy as something that we can act on, but also as something that shapes our everyday environments in chaotic and unequal ways. Elaine Frischo is a Professor of Architecture and Philosophy at the University of Melbourne, where she's also the Director of the Bachelor of Design faculty in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. She's an architectural theorist and philosopher, writer and critic, who's written, among other things, Creative Ecologies, which I've dipped into and have found very interesting. Ashley is a Professor of English at the Graduate Centre, City University, New York, and his fields of specialisation are cultural studies, environmental humanities, post-colonial studies and climate justice. Ashley also wrote a book called Extreme Cities, which I would recommend to anyone who's interested in cities, a very thoughtful read, and he weaves his creative way of writing in amongst theory and practical concepts. And I'm an associate professor based in the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT. My work focuses on how we might rethink the urban in terms of our human-nature relationships, as well as the need to repoliticise what we mean by sustainability as a transformative agenda in a climate of change. So our intention is that we have a part presentation from each of us and then part discussion as a collective. This is meant to be part provocation, part meditation, and thinking through together what the nature of the wild might be in these contemporary times. So each of us will have 10 minutes to explore the themes in our own books, which are actually very different, and then come together to speak to how they link into this idea of wild cities. I actually would like to invite Tess to go first. Ashley is going to be a little bit later. Tess, please share with us some of your provocative ideas around wild policy. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Oh, gosh, it really does work. Yeah, Molly is the dog at the back, so hopefully she'll be a very good audience member and not decide halfway through to come forward and put muddy paw prints on me and wild it up that way. So wild policy is the basis of 10 years worth of ethnographic fieldwork. I'm an anthropologist. The easiest way of understanding my work is bureaucrats are my natives, and I try and understand in what ways is this thing that we turn to for remedy, policy, also the thing that reproduces the troubles that we're in. And wild policy is my attempt to try and come to grips with that. It answers or probes a really simple question, namely, can there be good social policy in Indigenous and remote, regional and remote Australia? It's a straightforward question, can there be? The answer unravels as follows. Yes, there can be, and no, there cannot be. The yes, there can be is with a great deal of wit, energy and drive, people can make things work on the ground. You can take a funding program, let's say it's for a health service, let's say it's for renal dialysis on country, and with a lot of drive, you can force that thing to actually do what it's ostensibly meant to do, which is to help people live for longer periods of time connected to their kin and where they're affiliated with. You can do that. My question is, yeah, but why is it so hard? Why does it have to take all that drive, energy and determination to hold in place? Even something so straightforward as that takes so many people burning themselves out to put in place and then to hold it. And then you have to ask the question as well, is that even a good thing to do? Is prolonging death in that way, which is what the death machine called a dialysis is actually doing, is prolonging death in that way the best energy expenditure, or should you be trying to interrupt the thing that is causing such rampant chronic disease in the first place? So you can keep on going. So people are sort of throwing themselves onto this shrine of trying to make things work. So I keep probing that question. Why is it so hard? Because actually for a lot of this stuff, the jury is in. It's not a mystery. We do know how to actually build houses that work well for people, that enable people to live with dignity in place, to age in place. We know how to do that. We do know that climate change is happening. We could build toward that. We do know that water is an essential ingredient of everyday life, that you cannot live without it. So we do know that contaminating water is something that you ought not to do. So it's not actually that thing called wicked. That's a category that I object to for lots of reasons, but it's not wicked. It's knowable and it's known. So if you keep probing that question, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard? I actually came to this other landing point. And that landing point takes me to the no. Yes, it can be, and no, it can't be. The no is because there is no greater dependency in Australia to getting it right. So nobody's life will fall apart if you don't do Indigenous policy well, and you don't deliver well for Indigenous people in regional and remote Australia. Morally, yeah, we can all lie on our backs and kick our legs in the air. You might feel devastated at that, but actually nobody's living circumstances will be altered if this thing continues to be done in a desultory, pathetic way, in a broken way. Nobody's. There is no greater dependency on getting it right. Why is there no greater dependency on getting it right? Because the extractive settler state already has what it needs to secure the conditions of our collective good life. Those are the extractive conditions of resources and land and a whole lot of things. Having secured that and re-secured it, because it's never truly settled, the settler state is always in a process of still trying to assure its settlement. Having secured it and re-secured it with every mechanism under the book, including the policy playbook, there is no greater dependency on getting the collateral effect of trying to remediate some of the fallout of that foundational primacy of securing the settler good life. The collateral damages remediated through beneficial or benevolent social policy can be quite second rate and hard won and hard to prosecute and take a lot of energy and be sacrificial. That's the ethnographic nutshell. The other part of wild policy offers something quite different, which is, in order to come to that, I had to rethink what policy was. to try and look at policy with the curiosity of an alien, what anthropologists are constantly trying to do, which is to pull themselves out of a thing and to make something familiar strange. And in doing that, I needed to stop thinking of policy in the way that all my liberal training had taught me to do it, which is to think of it as legislation or regulation or something that you put in place by going to the government with your good evidence and try and create a change in the world, all of which I've done. I'm an ex-ministerial advisor, I'm an ex-senior bureaucrat. I've done a lot of that stuff, and there's a lot of reason to work in that world. But I started to think of policy as only partly that. And I called that side of policy, where you're trying to change a regulation, change legislation, etc., artefactual policy. But I also wanted to think about the conditioned policies that are already sunk into our everyday environments to the point where we no longer give them a name. And I gave that the term ambient policy. And I started also to think of the policies that you carry forward in your own DNA, either as privilege, as non-chronicity, or as impoverishment. Some people call it epigenetics. You can call it lots of things. I call that policy hauntology. So I had 3 different registers of thinking about policy, and so wild policy also sets that out. So the nutshell of the book Wild Policy is it answers my question, can there be good policy? Answer, yes and no, and why? And then it also gives you, I hope, a different way of thinking about what is this thing called policy that we have so much hope and faith in, and yet is a powerful tool, but it has its limits too, if we don't think of it as already embedded in our environments. That's me.
Great. Thank you, Tess. Yes, this idea that policy is somehow rational, ordered, sensible, thoughtful has been disrupted utterly by Tess in her book, but not unhopefully. And in similar but different ways, Elaine, you do that to architectural theory. Would you like to expand on that a bit more, or take your own particular avenue in your work?
Thanks, Wendy. I've got a little pile of books down here because I realise in the midst of sort of telling you about dirty theory, any book is a kind of open project that interconnects with other books, and dirty theory in a way comes off the back of creative ecologies. Oh, it's okay. I don't know. And before that, I just wanted to acknowledge this other work, and I've got Hélène, one of my co-editors in the room, work that we did in Sweden on architecture and feminisms, ecologies, economies, technologies. And setting up the creative ecology book, there was this funny little pink book called How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool, which was lots of fun to write and came very much out of my pedagogical engagements. Dirty theory is the sort of most recent of these various adventures. And I'm sitting here today, I think, because when we're thinking of engaging in this thing called dirty theory, which is not a new idea, it's already been kind of besmudged and handed around, and we're placing it alongside not so much the wild or wilderness, but processes of wilding and rewilding, and of course we have to cautiously move around these concepts. Both of them, both wilding, both getting dirty, can be considered as concepts and also methods, approaches to the kinds of problems that we probably need to be dealing with very seriously today amidst our climate crises. We need to be wary of them because they're very likely to get the better of us. The wilderness encroaches in that Gaia intrudes in our everyday lives to such an extent that we finally acknowledge amidst the Anthropocene that we are nature, anthropos, human subjects. We have wreaked the wild devastation on a planetary scale. Or else, perhaps the wilderness was never out there after all. It's a story we've told ourselves to construct our own shelters. The wilderness, rather, has always been embedded deep inside of us, rendered evident through human acts of disregard and destruction, and the sectioning off of what we call or classify as dirt. So here, human colonisation and territorialisation constitute the rowdiest behaviours of all, a point that I think Wendy Steele frequently makes in her book, Planning Wild Cities, where the wild turns out to be more about the coloniser often than the colonised. But we can turn wilding, and we can turn this kind of making dirty around and around. Both of them a little bit like the ancient concept of the pharmacon, poison and cure simultaneously. And they each demand that we pay attention to the particular situation we are embedded in. So let's think about dirt for a moment. Let's think about dirt in the sense of its positive attributes as the soil that sustains by way of its agricultural function. Then, on the other hand, dirt in the negative as disease and infection that destroys us. Still, looking at it from the negative and the positive points of view assumes a particular point of view. For the forests that have been cleared to make way for cattle to graze, the newly accessible soil might sustain human consumption for a while, but to the detriment of the forest as a degraded or lost ecosystem, and eventually to our own environmental detriment, as sparser forests mean reduced capacity for carbon sequestration and less air to breathe. While the bacteria, or let's say the dirt understood as virus, and this might be to push a metaphor, certainly this, though, is something that we've all become intimately familiar with. While this kind of dirt slowly destroys the collective human species, nevertheless, it's good news for the virus, which spreads and enjoys its own capacity for liveliness, if we can speak of viruses in such a way. So there's a deep ambivalence nested in both concepts, and when we apply them and run them through our methodologies, we might succeed, but we might also fail in our use of them. But let's get finally to this little book called Dirty Theory, which I'd so love to be an ethnographer and say that I was out in the field working on this for 10 years. It did live in a folder in my computer for maybe that amount of time as I kind of added notes to this theme. It's a theme that's been invested in by architectural theorists, by geographers, famously by ethnographers, and I'll get to that in a little while. And obviously, when it comes to architecture, architecture is apt to get dirt quite literally into its crevices, nooks and crannies, causing a nuisance, demanding constant clean-up jobs. Dirt quite literally troubles architecture, which too often wants to ignore the ongoing necessity of maintenance and repair, that constant kind of labour, which is also a reproductive labour. Architecture instead wants to clean surface, the mediatised image. We see many examples around us here today. And if dirt appears in the image, it's because it's been styled to exist there. It's been curated and made aesthetic. So here's one of the risks of dirt, of course, and our dealing with dirt, that we are ever at risk of aestheticising dirt. There are such things as dirty houses designed as dirty houses. So dirt and then dirty as an adjective are mobilised in this book as subject matter for consideration. So it's both the stuff that I'm looking at, as well as offering an approach or a methodology, how the theory allows me to kind of perceive and work with certain problems. But what do I mean by dirty theory? Concepts, or what I call concept tools in this book, Creative Ecologies, need to hit the empirical ground. It's all very well to sort of entertain theory for the sake of theory, but we've got to get down dirty with a problem that we need to grapple with, make the theory do its work. The dirty part of theory is here in the book to remind us that theory can never be undertaken as an objective mode of analysis or observation at a secure distance. The dirty theorist is always kind of, embroiled in the field that they're studying, in the situation that they're part of. And in witnessing, let's say, an event, in attempting to analyse a situation, their very subjective position comes to be, can be radically kind of destabilised. I warn my students in particular that theory and philosophy constitute dangerous material semiotic work. When you start the labour of thinking, then you begin to see the world in a different way, and this can be extraordinarily challenging. It's really great to have a student in the audience today. So this little book is divided into a number of small chapters, 11 in total, and an introduction and a conclusion, and each chapter briefly ventures a topic and sometimes offers the story of an aesthetic figure too. There are the performative clean-up jobs of Maulukeles and Catherine Schoenfeld and Juliana Preston, all working in a kind of space between, I guess, spatial practices, architecture and art and feminist performance. There's the soil currency of Claire Pentecost. There are the delightful dirty ditties and dirty drawings of the wonderful theorist and architect Jennifer Bloomer. But as I proceed through the book, it's important for me to stress how much each chapter is a little bit like a test site. In fact, this book constitutes less of a completed book as a sort of experiment awaiting future work. It begins to explore certain themes, and it sits within a series called Art, Architecture, Design Research, the publisher of which is sitting here in the audience too, the gorgeous bearded man over here, Rocco Sinkel.
Gorgeous bearded man.
And amidst all of this, I'm in a way I really need to stress how much it's a mode of exploration being undertaken here. It's a promissory note to myself for future work. And this is also where one of the key conceptual persona in the book emerges, and that is the theory slut, recognising the capacity, especially in a discipline such as architecture, to be racing after the latest theoretical paradigm, to see how we can incorporate it into our work. So how do we become sufficiently reflective about that? Well, the other thing about the slut, of course, is that the slut is the one who's prepared to let her house go to ruin, to be unclean, because she's got important intellectual labour to undertake. So I kind of play on this sort of double movement there. The subtitle is Troubling Architecture, and architecture in this book is troubled at least in two ways. In the sense that feminist philosopher Judith Butler suggests, where she argues that gender is troubled through its very performance, thereby challenging norms and breaking down categories and stereotypes, very important work that has to be undertaken in architecture, which has obvious gender biases. And also in the sense that philosopher of science and technology Donna Haraway calls for, that is that we must stay with the trouble, which means acknowledging that there are no easily secured solutions, and sometimes we just have to develop means of coping and getting by amidst our environment worlds. Now, this is where I get to, a key thinker who is an ethnographer who gives us, in fact, one of the most cited definitions of dirt, a formula that is much cited across many disciplinary domains. And this is Mary Douglas in her book, very famous book, Purity and Danger, an analysis of the concepts of pollution and taboo. And this much cited definition is that dirt can be defined as matter out of place. We could spend another hour talking about all the implications of thinking in this way and all the controversies about how we understand what she means. But what struck me in looking in her book was that, in fact, she is citing a pragmatist philosopher called William James. And for him, he's talking about dirt in terms of the irrelevance and accident that troubles the order of things, our habitual ways of organising our structures of society and so forth. He's talking in particular about religion here. And he is the one from whom she draws this definition, so much dirt, as it were, and matter out of place. So we have this idea of cosmologies where there's a ritual mixing up of matter, where sometimes dirt that's excluded comes to be included and raised up as sacred or special. And I think this whole process of selection, extraction and specification of the dirt draws attention to what designers do in organising the worlds around them. And this is where I'm going to close, because what Mary Douglas draws our attention to finally, and I guess it's the final point I begin to make in the book, is that dirt is an inherently creative force. If it's chaotic, it is that stuff from which we can create a minimum of order. But of course it can also overtake us. And so this feeling of dirt offers, at the very least, an opportunity of engaging in our worlds and perhaps stirring, if we're so lucky, our creative capacities.
Thank you, Elaine. So hold those ideas, those provocative ideas of dirt theory and of wild policy. I'm going to turn now, hopefully, to Ashley Dawson, who's going to land that in relation to climate justice in New York City. So fingers crossed that this will work. How are we going, Matt? If for some reason it doesn't work, and we have your emails, we could email you his presentation so that you don't miss out on this, but it may be that we do or do not see it today. Which for his sake would be a shame because he's put some thought into it. So.
Hey.
It might start playing.
And then if the volume can
The
go
volume
up.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is like being a university lecturer. Familiar with Ashley's introduction.
I feel like we're
Be
at,
able to.
I feel like we're at the University of Sydney. This is just like classic lecture mode.
It's always like, the moment you put technology in the mix. Yeah.
Good thinking.
Hello, this is Ashley Dawson. I'm very happy to be joining you on this panel for Melbourne Design Week and Book Fair remotely from my home here in New York City. So today I'll be presenting on popular planning for wild cities. Obviously, nature is present in cities, but it's coming in a far more interruptive fashion into cities as a result of anthropogenic climate change. You see here the New York City Hurricane Evacuation Zone Finder available to residents online, and from the red zones you can tell that many parts of Manhattan and of its surrounding boroughs are extremely threatened by hurricanes. And as I've outlined in previous work of mine, such as my book Extreme Cities, urban inequalities, particularly class and race inequalities, map onto areas of threat, so that it's the outer boroughs that are predominantly populated by people of color and working class people that are most threatened. How are cities responding to these threats to the urban fabric? Well, in the case of New York City, following Hurricane Sandy's devastation, a very high-profile series of design competitions was mounted called Rebuild by Design. The top winning proposal from this competition was called the Big U, and you can see here in this image that the design called for putting a series of landscaped parks around the bottom half of Manhattan that would protect the city from storm surge, such as the ones that had devastated New York City during Hurricane Sandy. And this form of protective landscaping would also help to create natural areas in the city, which would be a significant amenity for working class populations who are very much deprived of access to green space and to the forms of recreation and clean air that come with that green space. So the proposal was extremely positive and was well received by communities who had fought hard to get it to be shaped around people's desire for increasing green space instead of simply protective barriers to make sure that Wall Street and other high value and high income parts of the city were protected. Another interesting example that came from the Rebuild by Design proposal is the Living Breakwaters proposal from Scape Studios, which calls for a series of breakwaters around the southern part of Staten Island, the most southerly of New York's boroughs. And as you can see here, the breakwaters would be partially designed by humans, but then would also have additional non-human components, such as oyster reefs that would grow on top of the breakwaters, and which would help to slow an oncoming storm surge, such as the one that devastated. And you can see here in this image that Scape Studios calls for the breakwaters to be integrated into local cultures that would educate people about the waters that surround their terrestrial homes so that people are more integrated into the natural world. Now, these two projects are still being built, but we are examples of this kind of protective design in Hunters Point Park in Long Island City, New York, which is in Queens, just across the water from Manhattan, as you can see in this image. Protective landscaping has been put in place, along with some very attractive walkways for people. So you get a sense that the ideas behind the big U are already being realized. And here you can see another part of that same park where a recreational field has been created, which also functions as a water absorption design feature in the case of a storm surge. But if you turn your back from these important and attractive design features, what you see is massive development, so that the incorporation of attractive natural features that are also protective into the city has come with a kind of quid pro quo for really significant real estate development for the 1%, for wealthy elites in the city. And so to go back to a point that I made at the outset, what we can see is that potential displacement within New York City needs to be thought in a kind of intersectional way. This map by my friend, the urban planner Arash Karwazad, tries to give you a visual image of the intersectional nature of displacement by overlaying flood zones with areas that are rent stressed and low income. So that if we are going to think about displacement, we need to think about all of these factors in relation to one another, rather than thinking about natural systems or incursions of nature into the city in a sort of isolated way, disjunct from forms of social struggle and inequality. And of course, over the last year, we've been living through another relatively under-acknowledged form of natural incursion into the cities, and that's the pandemic, right, where a virus that results from human incursion into wild areas in parts of the world is translated globally through our elaborated social networks and really magnifies existing forms of urban inequality. So over the last year, New York City has been really hard hit, and we know that the areas that have been most affected by the pandemic have been areas that are low income and are populated by people of color. And of course, those are the areas that are struggling the most to get access to vaccines. So another example of the playing out of natural systems, the climate emergency, and urban inequality. The last year has also, of course, featured uprisings against police violence and against forms of extreme attacks on black communities, including in New York City with the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle for abolition of the carceral state. In response to that, the Trump administration labeled cities like New York, Seattle, and Portland anarchist jurisdictions and threatened to withdraw federal funding from those cities. In the context of what has resulted is really strong movements of mutual aid as communities who have been cut loose from state funding and from help have turned to one another to support one another through things like this community refrigerator. And these mutual aid efforts build on more long struggles for transformation of urban infrastructures that challenge the existing forms of the fossil capitalist state, including grassroots struggles for clean, democratic, renewable energy, and for forms of popular control over development, such as this poster from the environmental justice organization Uprose, which is based in Brooklyn, makes clear. Uprose proposes what they call the grid, the green development zone, rather than having an exploitative form of development driven by real estate interests in the city. And in the case of grid, this would involve industrial manufacturing of wind turbines that could go in wind farms off the coast of New York City in order to increase the percentage of renewable energy in New York City's grid, which is woefully low. The last form of kind of popular planning for climate action and for urban transformation that I want to emphasize is FTP, which has struggled over the last year. In fact, it was a kind of predecessor of the Black Lives Matter movement against police targeting of communities of color. FTP has been translated in a number of different ways, but it's most usually associated with fuck the and so you can see that there's a movement here against police attacks on young people and people of color in the subway system in New York City, but also an assertion that subways ought to be free for all people. And this very much challenges the longstanding attacks on public infrastructure and particularly the ways in which austerity in the context of the pandemic is playing out on urban terrain. And I think we need to see it as another example of an intersectional struggle for climate justice, since maintaining public transportation is part of a whole suite of other actions that have to also include maintaining efficient public housing in order to keep New York City's carbon footprint as low as possible and to lay the groundwork for an urban Green New Deal. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I can't be with you, and I send you my best wishes for a successful discussion.
Thanks to Ashley, a delightful person. And if you're interested in his work, go to his books. Or there's a great in-conversation between Ashley and Naomi Klein on climate justice and energy commons that you can find on YouTube. So if you just Google that, it comes up. It goes for about 20 minutes. It's really interesting. So look, to round us out, for the last 10 minutes, I'd like to offer you a meditation on wild cities. So I would invite you to kind of sit back, take a deep breath, be lulled into this thinking around what the nature of wild cities is about. So our cities are now capable of being seen from space. They are the superstructures of the superspecies in the age of the Anthropocene. Our cities are home to more than half the world's population, consume nearly 3/4 of its natural resources, and are highly vulnerable to the impacts of human-induced climate change. So important questions around urban food, energy, water, housing, transport, all jostle for public and policy attention, along with ecological design, social justice imperatives, and issues of infrastructure that Ashley talks about in terms of provision and development. So there's a restless urban churning at both the global and local scales, where cities serve as the discursive sites and the mirror for society's contradictions and anxieties. Robert Beauregard has described cities as places of decay, moral turpitude and social disorganisation. Mike Davidson's vision is famously of a planet of slums, dystopic, squatting in its own excrement, surrounded by pollution and decay of its own making. While Abani describes the city as half slum, half paradise, and wonders how it can be so incredibly violent, so terribly ugly, and yet so achingly beautiful all at the same time. As Akami observes, we live in the age of cities. The city is everything to us. It consumes us, we glorify it. But I would add we also fear it, and we fear these urban worlds and their earthly wounds. So in the 21st century, both wild and city, we argue, are key words, and there's an entanglement here of words, wounds and worlds. And taking a leaf from my colleagues in the Writing and Publishing Lab at RMIT, this is about writing the future. So this is writing as in W-R-I-T-I-N-G as an academic call to action through the communication of active research and scholarship, as we've heard from both Tess and Hélène in their different ways, and also, of course, Ashley. But also in terms of writing, R-I-G-H-T, as an ethical commitment to justice and equity, to bearing witness, to upholding, supporting and restoring the future. Raymond Williams argued in his exploration of keywords in the 1980s that this is not a neutral review of meanings around words. It's an exploration of the vocabulary of a crucial area of social and cultural discussion, political discussion, which has to be made conscious and critical. A vocabulary which finds ways to change as we find it necessary to change, as we go on making our own history, our own language, our own history, and on it goes. So whilst his and others focused on keywords such as society, welfare, tradition, community, family, all of these are still vitally relevant, there's been a new resurgence of cross-disciplinary words such as, those that surround questions of ecological justice, about Indigenous sovereignty, about the planetary crisis. So 21st century keywords are care, fracking, margin, rift, the commons, the Anthropocene. These are offered up by radical geographers as understandings but also contestations about how we see and experience the world today. Rosie Brodotti's post-human glossary, for example, outlines words such as capitalocene, eco-sophies, digital activism, and the inhuman as ways of thinking about our contemporary context. And new activist collectives, such as colleagues in Sydney who've set up the Shadow Places Network, they seek to engage with keywords as a way of creatively shaping and reshaping the medium to reimagine connections between people and place in climate change. The environmental humanities describes this as a living lexicon. The ambition is no less than a contemporary lingua franca that seeks to disrupt and unsettle significantly old positionings, as Tess is doing with the idea around policy being ordered and sane, with an emphasis on radical intellectual and activist praxis. And yet hardly any of these new ambitions are seeking to tussle with the words wild or city, which I find extraordinary given how potent they both are in this contemporary age, and particularly the way in which they lean up against each other, entangled, co-constructed and co-produced in ways that Laura Kipnis talks about against love, and how we might think about the leaning against but also the pushing apart. So the paradoxical idea of the wild city as part lens, as part provocation, a part meditation on planning cities in a climate of change, the uncivilized civilization, natural unsettlements, turbulent cohabitations. I mean, within the context of the Anthropocene, the very idea of this highlights our aspirations, our anxieties, our collective passions and fetishes, and our relationships with the human, the non-human, each other and other. So a couple of different ways that this has been thought about. In 1977, the urban sociologist Manuel Castells wrote an essay, A Provocation, in which he focused on the urban question as the lens for the capacity for humans to act destructively in cities. He wanted to take us beyond the myth of what he described as the urban crisis, to draw critical attention to the production of urban space within the conditions of late capitalism. crisis in this sense is not, he argued, an innately urban condition, but an ideological expression of the efforts of the political elite to naturalise societal tensions and contradictions. For Castells, who famously said, if civic and environmental movements fail in their resistance to market logic, a new and more sinister urban form will arise, the wild city. And yet 50 years on, a very different vision is put forward by David Attenborough in A Life on Our Planet. It's hard not to be moved when the 94-year-old filmmaker stares into the camera, right at you directly, and describes the world's devastating biodiversity loss at the hands of humanity, tears in his eyes as he talks about the furious pace of human progress, unconstrained consumption, and the cumulative impacts of the climate emergency. He argues this is a witness statement, a warning for society of how we've squandered our gift, how we've overrun the world, that human beings are replacing what he calls the wild. And yet another vision comes from anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose, who describes within the context of decolonisation, in her book Reports from a Wild Country, that wild people, i.e. the colonisers, make wild country, i.e. degrading and failing. And she highlights the description of the invader Captain Cook by Hobbies Danyari, who's a now deceased Yarralin lawman and community leader. He said, Captain Cook was the wild one. He failed to recognise law, he destroyed people and country, lived by damage and promoted cruelty. She argues that in fact quiet country stands in contrast to the wild, which she terms as man-made and cattle-made. I mean, we know that early Australian cities were colonial settlements, and they were established on the genocide and stolen lands of Aboriginal people who had lived on and cared for the land for millennium. There are approximately 400 Aboriginal nations already in existence when the colonialists arrived in the 1700s. And yet, and where am I? And yet this was determined that it was terra nullius's, no one's land. And we know nothing could be further from the truth. As violent as it was prejudiced, Aboriginal genocide was based on the settler colonial racism which framed Aboriginal people as sullen wilderness that demands to be subdued and civilised. And this isn't just history. Indigenous communities in Australia continue to struggle with incarceration, with homelessness, with dislocation from history and heritage, as Tess's book so vividly and powerfully highlights. And references to this day in white Australia to wilderness areas such as the desert being untouched reinforce a remarkable blindness and cruel disrespect to Aboriginal people who have cared for country for thousands of years. So within a few years, white civilization has actually eroded and degraded country, the sea, the sky, the lands, the waterways. We've introduced exotic species. We have led to subsequent extinction of native species, the desert rat kangaroo, 2 kinds of bandicoot, 4 varieties of wallaby, the dusky flying fox, at the highest rate of anywhere in the world. Since colonisation, it's estimated that 30 out of 2,273 native animals have been extinct. And so this, it has been calculated, is a rate of 1 to 2 extinctions a year, which has global implications for biodiversity of the world more generally. So we live in cities, but we're situated in damaged and wounded country. Founded in this disjuncture, detached from moral accountability, how, Rose asks, can we, the wild, and that's contested and obviously not a singular notion, possibly process or progress a politics of what she says we need as de-wilding instead of a kind of, sort of romantic call for rewilding. She argues the path depends on recognising there is these interconnections between Indigenous people, between settler people, between environments, places and spaces, and that this will lead to an ethical commitment of intention, not just relying on some kind of misty-eyed hope to usher in a different kind of future that will address the climate emergency. And meanwhile, we retreat to our wildly unsustainable cities, wasteful of water, food and energy, ignorant to the spiritual and cultural connections of Indigenous people to their land for most of the part around us. So, to quote Rose, Australia is part of the global scene in the number of extinctions, in the production of waste and damage, including greenhouse gases, that promotes extinction. The violence wrought on Indigenous systems, the practice and making of the wild is long-standing and ongoing in the wake of settler ecocide. So herein lies the dilemma. there are many different meanings that we can attach to notions of the wild, and what we've tried to do today is to highlight that it's not a singular, simple, us versus them, city versus nature, but this is a complex idea that involves all kinds of different ecologies, that involve policy, that involve theory, that involve practices, that involve cities, that involve our climate emergency. So William Cronin described in his book Uncommon Ground that there's no one concrete referent. And he went on to argue that engaging with the wild is at the end the simplest and most basic way for us to recollect and converge together around these different ideas of nature, culture and history and the world in which we know it. So when you couple wild with cities, this goes to the very core, I would argue, of the problem for settler societies. The hope of new worlds and better societies is built on this disjuncture. So finally, in the mythology of modernism, the city was depicted as a place where nature was tamed and domesticated into a kind of benign environment for physical human habitation, completely ignorant, of course, of our Indigenous communities and their connection to country. In the Anthropocene, cities are increasingly understood as vulnerable and major contributors to the planetary ecological crisis. This human versus non-human binary is deeply connected to our misunderstandings of settler colonial oppression of the colonised who have been framed as wild. And this binary doesn't exist within Indigenous communities and their connection to country. So wildness can be something to be cherished and honoured, but it can also be something to be denigrated and feared as part of a pervasive cycle. So caring with the wild city is about bearing witness. It is about being present. It's about questions of reconciliation and about questions and commitment to action. It's about entanglements, not taming. It's about fusions. Alternatives are entangled in the midst of the wild. They depend on the wild even as they resist it, says Rose. It gives us grounds for action. And this distinction allows for distance alongside responsibility and for ways in which collectively we can address this urban crisis. So I'll finish there and open it up more generally just to a discussion about, and back to the panel. Tess has come all the way from Sydney to join us here today, and every one of you who's made it to this room and this lovely space. What does it mean to be wild in the 21st century, and why should we care? I'll flip it to you guys first and then open it up for discussion.
Well, I can't help but go back to the images that we saw from Ashley. So the very compelling aesthetic, tamed wilderness of the U around, Manhattan Island, that's going to help, development to continue in its track, as distinct from the other kinds of practices that don't lend themselves to beautiful image-making productions, and placing them in contrast I thought was enormously powerful here. So the very dangerous role of the image that tries to sell us the sweet that, things are going to be better because we have these beautiful parks, when in fact that's shoring up other factors in urban environments, kind of really struck me. And it seems to be a theme that's running through. I was sort of also very much struck by Tess's yes and no. Not yes or no, but yes and no both simultaneously, and how we stay with that. But that's more a comment than a question.
So I'll address the term wild in my wild policy, because whilst I was talking about regional and remote Australia, I was also talking about the interdependencies. And I was very much saying we, all of us, are part of what I see happening in Indigenous Australia. We are part of what is taken from and reproduced in Indigenous Australia. And the wild part was also an inversion, because yes, policy is presented as the rational, state-based, authorising set of mechanisms to keep on improving this dysfunctional population group who, for whatever reason, sympathetic or hostile, whatever your political kind of way of looking at that might be, need some form of intervention. They need the state. They need more of what we have to offer. So I was trying to twist that around exactly with a Deborah Birdrose, the late Deborah Birdrose's incredible insight, which is to say that is not what is orderly. That is what is unruly. This is what is actually creating the disorder, and it's part of the reproductive system. I mean, it's the mitochondria powerhousing the cell that is the interventionary apparatus to continually recreate slots for its own necessity. So, you've got the talk about riffing here, but the problem of perpetual motion solved in how the bureaucratic apparatus is set up to constantly need its own presence to be there, doing things too. So the wild part was a flipping on that, but it was also to show this absolute interrelationship between what happens out there is what we are doing here. And the optimism part of that is to say, and it could be otherwise. It doesn't have to be like that. None of this is inevitable. It's just we've been conditioned to think it's this way. None of our social arrangements have to be as they are. We are completely encultured in multiple ways to think things have to be this way and could only be this way. That said, I'm not, Pollyanna. And very interestingly in my book, many of the case studies revolve around infrastructure. So pipes that don't connect, houses that don't assemble, houses that fall apart. I'm a repair and maintenance addict. I'm totally into the importance of repair as a form of sustainability. But I also ask questions about repairing what? Repairing hot shit boxes so that impoverished people can continue to live in hot shit boxes, So constantly sort of thinking about legacy infrastructure as not they can't be wished away. So the legacy infrastructure that we have in place needs to be repurposed, perhaps repaired, perhaps reinvented, but can't be wished away. We do have a lot of stuff sunk into place that needs to be really thought carefully if we're to live differently. And the assumptions that we can just do it through, doing a little bit of compost recycling and being a vegan doesn't cut it. Not when you look this thing in the eye. But it's optimistic.
Tess and I had a session on the Philosopher's Zone, which was really an interesting way to kind of tease out some of these ideas. And a dear friend of ours, Libby Porter, has written a review in Arena. And whilst we both love the review, one point she says is that both books are really depressing. And I guess, Tess, I was interested in your thoughts about it. Do you see the book that you wrote as a really depressing read? And be warned then, everyone in the room.
I mean, it's funny. Check the footnotes. There's jokes in there. It's depressing if you think that only little bits will work. So if that was your kind of faith system, it blows that apart, and that could be depressing. It's not depressing if you think... Has Molly recognised my voice finally? It's not depressing if you think, what happens to Indigenous people is made out to be as if this is the most that can be done is being done. That's an aesthetic. It's very well curated aesthetic to have us think that as much money as can be put to this is being put to this, as much effort as can be put to this is being put to this. That's all BS, capital letters, exclamation mark. Not true. What it is that's the best that can be expected. And if change pivots on what can be expected, I'm here to tell you expectations can change. And let's hope they can, because this is what we're right up against as women right now. Mm-hmm. Expectations have to change. We can change those expectations. Oh, look at that. We are changing cultures and systems and infrastructures and so on. So thinking differently, planning differently, imagining differently, based on clear-eyed, yes, depressing, clear-eyed views of what we are in and what we are up against and what are our legacy systems and what kind of entrenches things and makes moving away from that hard. That's necessary. So not being Pollyanna about it. It's necessary to look at this really, no Vaseline on the lenses. But that done, you can then say it's liberating. So I think it's not true that it's depressing. I think it's optimistic.
We'll have to talk to Libby further about that. Can I offer? I know time is of the essence here. Can I ask, for those of you that were drawn to come and hear people talk about wild cities, whether there are any thoughts or comments that you would like to share or ideas about it that spring to mind? We can extend the microphone if that's the case. Would anyone like to share? We are in a fairly intimate space, so it doesn't have to just be us talking. Yeah. Would you like to?
Sure, I can just try and speak up too. I was just really taken with Ashley's framing of mutual aid networks and thank you, grassroots movements as popular planning, and it sort of aligns with some of the work I've done on kind of dirty sociality. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what dirty policy might look like.
Actually, why don't you just tell everybody the title of your book?
It's called A Mass Conspiracy to Feed People. It's about a movement called Food Not Bombs, and they dumpster dive, cook the food and hand it out to people who would have gone hungry. So like
Dumpster diving.
yes, and dirty kind of popular planning. Apparently, I hadn't thought about it in that frame. Yeah, but so I'd be really interested to hear about grassroots planning as dirty policy, or what forms of policy might be dirty.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, right. Well, you use the word slutty as well. I mean, this is really interesting to me. And slutty policy. Oh, and interestingly, I also call for dirty materialism. Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, I use that. I say instead of yes, we need visionary metaphors, but we need dirty materialism. We need to stay grounded and to look at what we have, what's on the chessboard, what's sunk in place, what needs to be reinvented, not take any of it for granted, not any of it, not the sewage systems, not the water systems, the infrastructural life supports. We are all cyborgs. These things, it's not just in cities. We're connected to countries and extractive systems, extractive relations. All of that requires dirty materialism in order to fly, I think. So dirty policy would actually start to grapple with that, but from this business of we need an infrastructural commons, we need to reinvent differently. Consumerism is completely dependent on our individualising. And some things are not going to be very pleasant. I am totally an individualistic person. I do not like sharing my house. I don't like sharing anything really. But the dirty policy person in me recognises, we should have communal laundries. We should have, a whole lot of things just should not be based on individual consumption. Much as I don't want to live in that commune, but I sort of think that I don't really know how at this level of overpopulation across the world we can, keep on as we are. I just can't imagine how.
And the fact that that infrastructural commoning includes housing, it's not just those services that are, plugged into houses, but housing itself is an infrastructure. And if we can reconceptualise it as such, then, we organise that on a mass scale much as we do our roads or, our sewage pipes. And we include housing in that system, rendering it more readily available rather than exclusive. And so that's an architectural challenge, definitely.
I mean, dumpster diving is just such a wonderful confronting disruption to modernity, where everything was, hygienic, clean, sealed, not past its use-by date, etc., and to hell with all the excesses and the waste and everything else. But disrupting that is hard work, because people are locked in so much to that. Despite the fact that if we go to the extreme where the most sanitised products we can get actually are lifeless, they kill things, and so we kind of come full circle in our life forms.
And there are particular parts of the city where the dirty people are allowed to be, and where the dirty food is allowed to be.
Yeah, and indeed. Thanks so much for that comment.
Thanks.
Would anyone else like to highlight something from their own work or their own ideas? So you were a co-author with Hélène, were you? Yeah.
On the architecture, I was the co-editor of the Architecture and Feminism's anthology that we did together. I guess I'm coming from a disciplinary background in planning, and something that struck me in a question I'd like to put on the table is perhaps the scale of, it's the question of the relation to the state. And I think within the neoliberal present, we have this really difficult task in positioning ourselves, and I was thinking particularly with this wild policy And thank you so much for that talk. It was really moving, actually. I was thinking, how do we relate this then to our relation to the nation state particularly? How do we start to think about government in terms of the entrenched structures we already have and its various levels? Are we going to relate to this kind of going back to a municipality-based localism? Do we scale up to a planetary communism? How are you thinking about the nation state in your, it's not a comment, it's actually a question, but your investigations here, I'd love to hear more. And I haven't read your book, I'm sorry, there's a whole chapter on this. So we'll jump
That's sinful you haven't read it. Okay. I have a new concept called staying with the state. It's riffing off Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble. It's because I think, again, pretending that we can have some bloodless revolutionary future where everything magics itself towards rightness, R-I-G-H-T.
Writing the right,
is a failure of imagination, it's a failure of nerve, and yet every academic I know kind of drops mic at that point, concludes, gets themselves out of the critique by summonsing this magical kind of thing where somehow the sewage still kind of works. And it's like, no, a dirty materialism approach, a slutty policy approach, whatever we're talking about here. New things to think with. Yeah. Requires that we grapple with those things. But I also re-invoke the military as a key actor in this. The flip side of all the trade relationships are actually military pacts. Every single shipping freight container out there is following a trade route. That R-O-U-T-E. And that passageway is actually an historical pathway. That historical pathway has been carved through bloodshed. It has been carved through territorialisation of international waters and shipping routes. These things are also part of planetary futures. When you look at the density of it, just one blockage in the Suez Canal right now is showing you the density of it. 80% of the world's trade comes down through the Strait of Malacca. It explains why my hometown of Darwin is, in fact, part of the 4 places, Hawaii, Okinawa, Guam, Darwin, that the US occupy, in order that there is the ability to grab that choke point and choke it. So the extractive relations that I'm talking about, that we are all codependent on, actually has this much bigger meta-state reproductive powering that I am asking, all of us to start looking at and not being blind to, not being oblivious to, and not leaving it to the boys and their toys to think about, as if it is all just about arsenals and treaties. No, we're kind of codependent on these militarised trade relations too. So reimagining futures definitely is not just about reimagining how do we make the nation state be the thing for the people, but it's about really thinking about how does money and power operate on this extraterritorial basis. And I mean, I feel overwhelmed by that. I've poked at it. I've looked at how even land rights, even the original Northern Territory Land Rights Act, the best in class. We've not had anything as generous as that since. Everything else has been a watered-down, bastardised version. But even that primary Land Rights Act, Northern Territory Land Rights Act, was a military act. It was about also authorising the extraction of uranium for the nuclear industry. And it's got that in an annex. When you reread the Land Rights Act as actually securing rights to mineral access so that you don't have to keep on going back to court to work this stuff out. It's an absolute clarification of the rights to extraction. Secondarily, it's about, and here, if you have legitimate claims to land, here's the process of proof that you will need to now go through, which can in fact be a 20-year ordeal in the courts for you. But what it does foundationally is clarify extraction rights. When you flip it and you look at it with a militarised lens, you can see it really clearly. I was 30 years an anthropologist, never saw it. Never taught to see it. Anthropology has let me down. I think our disciplines let us down. I think our feminism lets us down if we don't remember
hang on, we used to know this stuff about how patriarchy worked. We used to know it, and we used to talk about it, and we used to give it names. So I'm giving you a complicated answer because you asked a complicated question. Yes, we need to think about the nation state. Yes, we need to think about what I call everyday militarisation. If we get to reimagine how this human people can live together in any kind of camaraderie, let alone sustainability, all of that needs to be part of our dirty materialism and our slutty policy.
Well, I think on that note, that powerful call to action there and critical thinking. Look, we might wrap it up. I know the next session is Planet City, which actually picks up a lot of these themes and twists them around in a different provocative way. Maybe, I don't know if you want to speak more to that, Matt, but yeah. Look, thank you so much for joining us for this session, and we'd like to see the conversation and the action around dumpster diving and other continue. So thank you.
Hit your microphone. Obviously, thank you all for coming today, and thank you very much to our speakers for your time and insights. It was a really compelling presentation from everyone, and I'm very sorry we didn't manage to get the PowerPoint working smoothly to begin with, but we got there in the end. So, and of course the books are available just outside, guys, if you're interested in picking a couple of them up, depressing or otherwise. Please join me in thanking our speakers.